The evening air bit at her cheeks as she walked toward her car, the plastic bag of groceries cutting into her fingers. It was the kind of cold that felt personal, that seemed to seep through her coat and settle deep in her bones. She had stayed late at the office again, trying to finish the quarterly reports that her boss had needed yesterday, if possible. The extra hours would mean a little more money for the bills, but tonight, they just meant she was walking through the nearly empty parking lot long after most people had gone home to their families. As she fumbled for her keys, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a text from her sister, but it was just a notification from the bank, another automatic payment about to process. She sighed, her breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air. The car started with a reluctant groan, and she turned the heat up as high as it would go, knowing it would take several minutes before the vents would blow anything but cold air. The drive home took her through the older part of town, where the streetlights cast long shadows between buildings. She usually took the highway, but construction had forced her onto this alternate route. At the third red light, she noticed him, a figure huddled on a bench at the bus stop, no bus in sight. Something about the way he sat, folded in on himself as if trying to disappear, made her look closer. He wore only a thin jacket, and his hands were tucked under his arms for warmth. The light turned green and she moved forward, but the image stayed with her. At the next light, she found herself looking in the rearview mirror, still thinking about the man on the bench. It was getting colder by the minute, and the weather report had mentioned freezing temperatures overnight. She thought about the extra blanket in her trunk, the thick wool one her mother had given her last winter, telling her to always keep it in the car for emergencies. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, her mother had said, wrapping it carefully in a plastic bag before placing it in the trunk. She pulled into the right lane, signaling to turn at the next corner. Her hands felt sweaty on the steering wheel despite the cold. What was she thinking? She didn't know this person. It could be dangerous. But then she thought about her own children, warm in their beds at home, and how she would want someone to help them if they were ever in a similar situation. Making a U-turn, she drove back toward the bus stop, her heart beating faster with each block. As she approached, she could see that the man hadn't moved. She parked a short distance away and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in the sudden silence. The grocery bag sat on the passenger seat, a reminder of the normal life she was supposed to be returning to. Taking a deep breath, she opened the trunk and retrieved the blanket. It was heavier than she remembered, and for a moment she considered just leaving it on the bench and driving away. But that felt wrong, disrespectful somehow. She walked toward the bus stop, the blanket folded over her arm. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. The man looked up, his face weathered and tired. His eyes widened slightly as if surprised that someone was speaking to him. "I noticed you don't have much protection from the cold," she continued, feeling awkward. "I have this extra blanket in my car. I thought you might be able to use it." He stared at her for a moment, then at the blanket and back at her face. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice raspy. "I know," she replied, stepping closer. "But I want to. It's supposed to get really cold tonight." As she held out the blanket, their hands brushed briefly when he reached for it. His fingers were like ice. He unfolded it slightly, examining the thick wool with a reverence that seemed disproportionate to the object itself. This is really nice," he said, looking up at her. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she replied, already backing away. "Stay warm." She turned and walked back to her car without looking back, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, awkwardness, and something else she couldn't quite identify. As she drove away, she glanced in the mirror and saw him wrapping the blanket around his shoulders, his movements slow and deliberate. The rest of the drive home passed in a blur. When she walked in the door, the familiar warmth of her apartment enveloped her, and for a moment she felt guilty for her comfort. Her youngest child was asleep on the couch, a textbook open on his chest. She covered him with a throw blanket and went to check on her older daughter, who was studying in her room. "Mom, you're late," her daughter said, looking up from her laptop. "Yeah, work was crazy," she replied, not mentioning the detour she had taken. "How's the studying going?" "Fine. Just trying to finish this paper before tomorrow." She nodded, looking around the room at the posters on the walls, the clothes draped over a chair, the small details that made up her daughter's world. They didn't have much. The apartment was small, and money was always tight. But they had each other, and they had a warm place to sleep. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the man at the bus stop. Where would he sleep tonight? Would the blanket be enough to keep him warm? She thought about her own bed, the comforter pulled up to her chin, and felt a pang of something that might have been guilt, or maybe just the recognition of how quickly circumstances could change. The next morning, as she drove to work, she considered taking the same route, just to see if he was still there. But she took the highway instead, telling herself it was faster, though she knew that wasn't the only reason. Part of her didn't want to know what had happened to him, didn't want to face the possibility that the small things she had done hadn't made any difference. At work, she tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept wandering. During her lunch break, she found herself scrolling through news articles about homelessness in the city, reading statistics that made her feel both overwhelmed and inadequate. How could one blanket possibly matter in the face of such widespread need? When she returned to her desk, her coworker mentioned that someone had been asking about her earlier in the day. A man? She asked, feeling a sudden spike of anxiety. No, a young woman. Said she saw something last night and wanted to talk to you about it. She spent the rest of the afternoon wondering what that could mean, half expecting someone to approach her with questions or accusations. By the time she left work, she was tense and tired, the events of the previous night weighing on her more than she had expected. As she walked to her car, her phone rang. It was her sister calling to check in as she did every few days. "Hey, how are you?" her sister asked. "Fine, just tired. Work was busy. Did you see that post going around online? About the woman who gave a blanket to a homeless man?" She stopped walking, her hand halfway to the car door. "No, I haven't checked social media today." "It's amazing. Someone took a photo of it and it's being shared everywhere. People are saying it restored their faith in humanity or something." Her heart started beating faster. "Where was this?" "Over by the old bus stop on Main Street, I think." The photo's a bit dark, but you can see her handing him the blanket. She didn't know what to say. The idea that her private moment of hesitation and compassion had been captured and shared with strangers felt violating somehow, but also strangely validating. "Are you there?" her sister asked. "Yeah, sorry. Just thinking. Anyway, I thought you'd appreciate hearing something positive for a change. Seems like there's still some good in the world, you know?" "Yeah," she replied, unlocking her car door. "There is." As she drove home, she thought about the ripple effect of her small action, how it had been witnessed, photographed, shared, and now was touching people she would never meet. The man at the bus stop was no longer just a stranger she had helped. He had become part of a larger story about kindness and connection. When she got home, she finally looked at the post her sister had mentioned. The photo was grainy and taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the silhouette of a woman handing a blanket to someone on a bench. The caption read, "Saw this happening tonight and wanted to share. In a world that often feels cold, someone chose to be warm. A kindness matters." Below the post, hundreds of comments had already appeared. People praising the anonymous woman, sharing their own stories of helping others, and vowing to be more aware of those in need. She read through them, feeling a complex mix of emotions, pride, embarrassment, and a renewed sense of purpose. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about how one small decision had created something larger than herself. The blanket she had given away was now with someone who needed it, but the act of giving it had somehow multiplied, reaching people she would never meet. She closed her eyes, not with the weight of her responsibilities as she usually did, but with the lightness that comes from knowing that even in a world full of challenges and hardships, a single moment of compassion can create ripples of change that extend far beyond what we can see. The morning after she had given away her mother's blanket began like any other workday. The alarm buzzed at 6 a.m. and she hit the snooze button twice before finally dragging herself out of bed. As she moved through her morning routine, making coffee, packing lunches for her children, checking her email, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. When she arrived at the office, her coworker greeted her with an unusually excited expression. "You're all over the internet," her coworker said, holding up a phone. She leaned closer, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The blanket woman." "That's you, isn't it?" There on the screen was the grainy photo from the night before, but now it had been shared thousands of times. The caption had been changed multiple times as different people had reposted it. but the essence remained the same. A stranger's act of kindness captured in a single moment. "I don't know," she replied, feeling her face grow warm. "It could be anyone." "No, it's definitely you," her coworker insisted. "Same coat, same height. People are calling you the blanket angel now." Throughout the day, more and more people mentioned the viral photo. Her boss called her into his office not to reprimand her, but to ask if the company could make a donation to a local shelter in her name. A local news station left a message asking for an interview. By lunchtime, she had received 27 friend requests from strangers and dozens of messages from people wanting to thank her for what she had done. That evening, when she picked up her children from school, her youngest was practically bouncing with excitement. "Mom, my teacher showed your picture in class today," he exclaimed. She said, "You're a hero." Her daughter was more reserved but seemed proud too. "Everyone's talking about it at school. Even people who don't normally talk to me came up to ask if it was really you in the photo." The attention was overwhelming. She had never been someone who sought the spotlight, preferring to live quietly and focus on her family and work. Now, suddenly, she was being held up as an example of kindness, a symbol of hope in what often felt like a hopeless world. That night, after putting the children to bed, she sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop, scrolling through the endless posts about her act of kindness. People had created hashtags, artwork, and even short poems inspired by the photo. Some had shared their own stories of helping others or being helped. A few had criticized her, suggesting it was all a publicity stunt or that she should have done more, but those comments were drowned out by the overwhelming positivity. As she read, she came across a post from someone who claimed to know the man from the bus stop. According to this person, he was a veteran who had fallen on hard times after returning from service overseas. The post included a link to a crowdfunding campaign that had been started to help him get back on his feet. In just one day, it had already raised thousands of dollars. She felt a mix of emotions, glad that he was getting help, but also uncomfortable with how much attention her small gesture was receiving. She hadn't done it for recognition or praise. She had simply seen someone in need and done what she could to help. The next morning, she received a call from a popular morning show that wanted to interview her. After much hesitation, she agreed, thinking that perhaps she could use the opportunity to redirect some of the attention to the broader issue of homelessness in their community. The interview was scheduled for the following day, giving her little time to prepare. She spent the evening thinking about what she wanted to say, not about herself, but about the many people in their city who needed help and how everyone could do something to make a difference, no matter how small. When she arrived at the television studio the next morning, she was nervous. The makeup artist powdered her face while the producer explained the format of the show. As she waited backstage, she could hear the host introducing her segment. "And now we have with us the woman who has captured hearts across the country with a simple act of kindness." The host's voice boomed. "Please welcome the blanket angel." She walked onto the set, blinking under the bright lights. The host greeted her warmly, and the interview began. "Tell us what happened that night," the host said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. She described the cold evening, seeing the man at the bus stop, and her internal debate about whether to stop and help. She spoke honestly about her hesitation and her eventual decision to offer the blanket. "What made you stop?" the host asked. "I just kept thinking about how cold it was going to get," she replied. "I have a warm home to go to, warm blankets, and he had nothing. It didn't feel right to just drive past." The interview continued for about 10 minutes with the host asking about her life, her children, and what she hoped people would take away from her story. She used the opportunity to talk about the local shelters and organizations that were working to help the homeless community, encouraging people to support them if they could. As the interview concluded, the host had one final question. "What would you say to people who think that what you did was nice but won't really make a difference in the grand scheme of things?" She thought for a moment before answering. "I would say that we can't always see the full impact of our actions. Maybe one blanket won't solve homelessness, but if it inspires someone else to help and then someone else, then together we can make a real difference." Small acts of kindness matter because they remind us of our shared humanity. When she left the studio, her phone was already buzzing with notifications. The interview had aired live and people were responding positively to her message. Throughout the day, she received calls from various organizations asking if she would be willing to help with their initiatives. A local bookstore offered to host a blanket drive. A restaurant owner promised to donate a portion of their weekend profits to a shelter. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. She agreed to participate in a blanket drive, not as the blanket angel, but simply as a concerned citizen who wanted to help. She visited the shelter where the man from the bus stop was reportedly staying, though she didn't try to meet him. It felt important to maintain his privacy and dignity. A week after the photo had first appeared online, she received an unexpected package in the mail. It contained a beautifully made quilt and a note that read, "I was so inspired by your story that I wanted to pay it forward. Please accept this as a replacement for the blanket you gave away, with gratitude for your kindness." She sat at her kitchen table, holding the quilt in her hands. It was heavier than the blanket she had given away, stitched with care by someone she would never meet. As she unfolded it, she noticed that attached to the back was a smaller quilt, just the right size for a child, with a note that read, "For your children, so they can continue their mother's legacy of kindness." Tears welled in her eyes as she thought about the journey of a single blanket, from her mother's hands to hers, from hers to a stranger, and now back to her in a different form, multiplied by the kindness of others. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, she used the new quilt to cover them both. Her youngest snuggled under it, his eyes already closing. "Mom," he mumbled sleepily, "can we help more people like you did?" She smoothed his hair, her heart full. "Yes, sweetie, we can always help more people." As she left their room, she thought about how her life had changed in just 1 week. She was still the same person, a single mother working hard to provide for her family. But she was also part of something larger now, a movement of kindness that had started with one simple act on a cold night. The viral photo had brought unexpected attention, but it had also created opportunities to make a real difference. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not just for herself and her family, but for their community and the possibility that even small gestures could create meaningful change. The community center basement buzzed with activity on Saturday morning. 2 weeks had passed since the photo of her giving away the blanket had gone viral, and now she stood surrounded by boxes, tables, and volunteers who had come together for the blanket drive she had reluctantly agreed to organize. What had started as a simple idea mentioned during her television appearance had grown into something much larger than she had anticipated. "Where should we put the children's blankets?" a young woman asked, holding up a colorful quilt with cartoon characters. She pointed to a designated area in the corner. "Over there, please. We're keeping them separate so we can make sure they go to families with kids." The woman nodded and hurried off, joining the dozen or so other volunteers who were sorting, folding, and organizing the donations that had been pouring in all week. The response had exceeded everyone's expectations. Not just blankets, but also warm clothing, sleeping bags, and even personal care items. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was the third call she had ignored that morning from a national news outlet, wanting to do a follow-up story. She appreciated the attention it brought to the cause, but she was growing increasingly uncomfortable with how much the focus remained on her, rather than the broader issue of homelessness and the many organizations that had been working on it for years. "Hey, can I steal you for a minute?" a man asked, approaching her with a clipboard in hand. She recognized him as the director of the local homeless shelter, one of several community leaders who had stepped forward to help coordinate the effort. "Of course," she replied, following him to a quieter corner of the room. "I wanted to give you an update on something," he said, lowering his voice. "We found the man from the photo. He's been staying at our shelter for the past week." She felt a sudden rush of emotion. "How is he?" "He's doing better. The viral photo actually helped in an unexpected way. Someone recognized him and reached out to his family. They hadn't been in touch for a while, but they're reconnecting now." She absorbed this information, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. "Does he know about all this?" she asked, gesturing around the room. "He knows, but he's a private person. He asked not to be identified publicly, which of course we're respecting. He did say he'd like to meet you though, when you're ready." The thought of meeting him felt both important and intimidating. Their interaction had been so brief, so ordinary in the moment, yet it had sparked this extraordinary chain of events. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Maybe after the drive is over." The director nodded. "Of course. Whenever you're ready." As he walked away, she noticed her daughter entering the basement with 2 of her friends, all carrying bags of donations. Her daughter had been somewhat distant since the story went viral, caught between pride in her mother's actions and the awkwardness of sudden attention at school. "Need help?" her daughter asked, setting down the bags. "Always," she replied with a smile. "We can use all the hands we can get." For the next hour, they worked side by side, sorting donations and organizing them into categories. The atmosphere in the room was energizing. People of all ages and backgrounds working together toward a common goal. She overheard conversations about other community initiatives, about how this event had inspired people to look for ways to help in their own neighborhoods. Around noon, a local restaurant owner arrived with containers of hot soup and bread for the volunteers. The woman had been one of the first to reach out after the television interview, offering to support the blanket drive with food for anyone who came to help. "I can't believe how many people showed up," the restaurant owner said, looking around the bustling room. "You've really started something special here." "It's not just me," she replied sincerely. "It's everyone here and everyone who donated, and everyone who shared that photo. We all started this together." Her daughter, who was listening nearby, smiled at this response. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from her daughter in days, and it eased some of the tension that had been building between them. By late afternoon, they had sorted through hundreds of donations. The plan was to distribute them the following day to various shelters and community organizations that had identified families and individuals in need. As the volunteers began to leave, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to help, she felt both exhausted and energized. Her daughter stayed behind to help clean up, her friends having already left. "You did a good thing today, Mom," her daughter said as they stacked empty boxes. "We all did," she corrected gently. "No, I mean it," her daughter insisted. "At first I was weird about all the attention, but seeing how many people came to help because of what you did, it's actually pretty amazing." She stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter, really looked at her, seeing not just a teenager caught between childhood and adulthood, but a thoughtful person developing her own understanding of the world and her place in it. "I'm glad you think so," she said softly. "But you don't need a viral photo or a big event to make a difference. You just need to pay attention to the people around you and help when you can." Her daughter nodded. "I know. That's what you always taught us." As they finished cleaning up and walked to the car, she thought about how this experience was shaping her children's understanding of community and responsibility. It wasn't the lesson she had planned to teach them, but perhaps it was one they needed to learn. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table going through the list of distribution points for the next day, her phone rang. It was the shelter director again. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he said. "No, it's fine. Is everything okay?" "Yes, everything's fine. I just wanted to let you know that the man from the photo, he'd really like to meet you tomorrow morning before the distribution starts. If you're still comfortable with that." She took a deep breath. "Yes, of course." "What time?" 8 o'clock at the shelter? We can meet in the dining room before it gets busy." "That works. I'll be there." After hanging up, she sat quietly for a moment thinking about the meeting ahead. What would she say to him? What would he say to her? Their connection had been so brief, yet it had fundamentally changed her life and the lives of so many others. The next morning, she arrived at the shelter a few minutes early. The director greeted her at the door and led her to the dining room, where a man was sitting at a table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window. As she approached, he turned, and their eyes met for the first time since that night at the bus stop. He looked different, cleaner, healthier, but his eyes held the same depth she had noticed before. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, standing up. "Of course," she replied, extending her hand. "It's nice to properly meet you." They sat down across from each other, an awkward silence hanging between them for a moment. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. "Not just for the blanket, but for everything that's happened since." "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I didn't do any of this for recognition." "I know that," he said with a small smile. "That's what makes it so meaningful. You have no idea how much that blanket meant to me that night. I was at a pretty low point, feeling invisible, and then you stopped. You saw me. That meant more than the warmth of the blanket, as much as I needed that too." She listened, moved by his words. "I'm glad I could help, but I want you to know this attention, the donations, all of it. It's not about me. It's about the many people who need help in our community." "I understand that," he said, "and I appreciate how you've used the attention to help others. But I also think it's okay to acknowledge that you did something special. Not everyone would have stopped. They talked for nearly an hour about his life before and after that night, about her family and how they were handling the unexpected attention, about the ways this experience had changed both of them. When they finished their conversation, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As she left the shelter to begin the day's distributions, she carried with me not just the weight of responsibility that had come with her unexpected fame, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The meeting had grounded her, reminding her that behind every statistic about homelessness were real people with stories, hopes, and dignity. The distribution day was busier and more organized than she had anticipated, thanks to the many volunteers who had shown up to help. They worked efficiently, loading vehicles with carefully packaged donations for delivery to shelters, community centers, and directly to families who had been identified as being in need. By late afternoon, as the last of the donations were being delivered, she received a call from her sister. "You're not going to believe this," her sister said excitedly. "A major retailer just announced they're going to match all donations to local shelters through the end of the month, and they specifically mentioned your story as their inspiration." She absorbed this information, feeling overwhelmed, but also hopeful. "That's incredible." "It really is," her sister agreed. "You've started something that's going to help so many people." As she ended the call and looked around at the remaining volunteers packing up the last items, she thought about how one small act of kindness had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted. The blanket she had given away had been replaced many times over, not just in physical donations, but in awareness, compassion, and a renewed sense of community responsibility. 3 weeks after the blanket drive, she was trying to return to normal. The media attention had finally begun to subside, though she still occasionally received messages from strangers who had been inspired by the story. Her children had settled back into their routines, and she had resumed her regular work schedule at the office. On Tuesday morning, as she was leaving for work, she noticed an unusual number of cars parked on her street. She thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps a neighbor was having a gathering, or there was an event at the nearby community center that she had forgotten about. When she returned home that evening, the street was even more crowded than before. Cars lined both sides of the road, extending around the corner and down the next block. As she looked for a parking spot, she noticed that many of the vehicles had out-of-state license plates. "What's going on?" her daughter asked from the passenger seat. "I'm not sure," she replied, finally finding a spot 2 blocks from their apartment building. As they walked home, they passed groups of people who seemed to be looking for something, or someone. Several of them glanced in her direction with recognition, though no one approached her directly. Inside their apartment, her youngest met her at the door with an excited expression. "Mom, people have been coming by all day. They want to see where the blanket angel lives." She felt a knot form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "People are driving from other places to take pictures of our building," he explained. "Some of them left notes and flowers by the door." Her daughter looked at her with concern. "This is getting weird, Mom." She agreed but didn't want to alarm her children. "It'll probably die down in a day or 2. The next morning, the situation hadn't improved. If anything, more cars had arrived overnight. As she left for work, she noticed people taking photos of the apartment building, and some even gathered near the entrance. At the office, her coworker greeted her with an expression of concern. "Did you see what's happening at your place?" her coworker asked. "I saw the cars. Do you know what's going on?" "It's because of that article that came out yesterday," her coworker replied, pulling up something on their phone. "The one identifying your address." She leaned closer to read the screen. A local blogger had somehow discovered where she lived and published the information, framing it as a pilgrimage site for people inspired by her story. The post included photos of the building and even directions for out-of-town visitors. "I can't believe someone would do this," she said, feeling a mix of anger and violation. "Have you considered contacting the police?" her coworker asked. "I don't know what they could do," she replied. "These people aren't breaking the law, they're just invading my privacy." Throughout the day, she received calls from concerned friends and family members who had seen the article or heard about the gathering outside her home. Her sister was particularly upset. "This has gone too far," her sister said over the phone. "You need to do something." "What can I do?" she asked, feeling helpless. "I never asked for any of this attention." You could make a statement asking people to respect your privacy, her sister suggested, or maybe move temporarily until this dies down. The idea of moving felt like giving up, like letting the attention dictate her life. But the thought of her children being subjected to this level of scrutiny was even more troubling. That evening, as she approached her building, she saw that the crowd had grown. People were milling about, some taking photos, others leaving flowers and handwritten notes by the entrance. A few had brought blankets and sleeping bags, apparently intending to stay overnight. She took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, keeping her head down. As she neared the door, a young woman approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," the woman said. "Are you—" She stopped and turned to face the woman, who looked to be in her early 20s and had traveled a long way, judging by the weary expression on her face. "Yes," she replied simply. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "I drove all the way from Ohio after reading your story. I've been going through a hard time and knowing that there are still good people in the world. It helped me more than you can imagine." She looked at the woman's face, saw the genuine emotion there, and felt some of her frustration soften. "I'm glad my story helped you, but you should know, I'm just a regular person trying to do the right thing. You don't need to make a pilgrimage to see where I live." "I know," the woman replied. "But seeing this place, knowing that something so beautiful started here, it gives me hope." As they spoke, others began to gather around, listening to their conversation. Some had cameras ready, while others simply stood quietly, watching. She realized this was a moment that could go either way. She could retreat into the building and let the crowd continue to grow, or she could address them directly. "Everyone," she said, raising her voice slightly. "Can I have your attention for a moment?" The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward her. "I appreciate that you've been inspired by what happened," she began, "but I need to ask you to please respect my privacy, and that of my neighbors. This is my home, not a tourist attraction." A few people looked disappointed, but most seemed to understand. "If you really want to honor what this is about," she continued, "there are many ways you can help people in need in your own communities. The shelters and organizations that receive donations from the blanket drive still need support. That's where your energy would be best directed." An older man in the crowd spoke up. "We understand and we're sorry if we've made you uncomfortable. We just wanted to connect with something positive for a change." "I appreciate that," she replied sincerely. "But the best way to connect with it is to carry it forward in your own lives, not to gather outside my apartment building." After a few more questions and expressions of gratitude, the crowd began to disperse. Some left immediately, while others lingered for a while longer before departing. By nightfall, most of the cars were gone, though a few remained, their occupants apparently determined to stay until morning. Inside her apartment, she found her children watching from the window. "Is it over?" her youngest asked. "Mostly," she replied, joining them at the window. "There are still a few people outside, but most of them left." "Mom," her daughter said quietly, "are we safe?" She wrapped her arms around both children, pulling them close. "Yes, we're safe. These people aren't here to hurt us. They're just confused about how to show their appreciation." "Will they come back tomorrow?" her youngest asked. "Maybe some of them," she admitted. "But I think most of them understand now that this isn't the right way to honor what happened." That night she lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. What had started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into something much larger and more complex than she could have imagined. The attention had brought positive change, donations for shelters, increased awareness about homelessness, but it had also come at a personal cost. The next morning, she woke early to find that a few cars were still parked on her street, but the crowd had diminished significantly. As she left for work, she noticed that someone had left a bouquet of flowers and a handwritten note by the entrance of the building. The note read, "Thank you for reminding us that goodness still exists in the world. We're sorry if we made you uncomfortable. We'll pay your kindness forward in our own communities." She took the flowers inside, feeling a mix of emotions, frustration at the invasion of her privacy, but also gratitude that people had been moved to help others by her story. At work, she received a call from the shelter director. "I heard about what happened at your place," he said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she replied. "It was a bit overwhelming, but I think most people have left now." "Good. I wanted to let you know that because of the increased attention, we've received enough donations to expand our winter program. We'll be able to provide shelter for 20 additional people each night." She felt a surge of emotion at this news. "That's wonderful. It really is," he agreed. "And it's all because of you." "No," she corrected gently. "It's because of everyone who chose to help." As she ended the call, she thought about the strange paradox of her situation, the personal invasion of privacy that had led to increased support for people in need. It wasn't a comfortable balance, but it seemed to be the reality of her new life. That evening, when she returned home, only one car remained parked on her street. As she approached her building, a woman stepped out of the car and approached her hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "I just wanted to thank you before I head back home." "Where are you from?" she asked. "Michigan," the woman replied. "I read about what you did, and it inspired me to start a similar blanket drive in my community. We collected over 200 blankets last weekend." She felt a genuine smile spread across her face. "That's amazing. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. I know you've been dealing with a lot of attention," the woman continued. "I hope we haven't added to your burden." "Just seeing the positive impact it's having makes it worthwhile," she replied sincerely. After the woman left, she stood for a moment in the fading light, thinking about how far her simple act of kindness had reached. The cars and crowds had been intrusive and uncomfortable, but they represented something deeper, a collective yearning for hope and goodness in a world that often felt lacking in both. 6 months after the night she had given away her mother's blanket, she stood in a packed auditorium, looking out at hundreds of faces turned toward her with expectation. The community organization that had coordinated the blanket drive had invited her to speak at their annual fundraising event, and after weeks of hesitation she had finally agreed. As she approached the podium, her hands felt sweaty and her heart raced. Public speaking had never been her strength, and she still felt uncomfortable with the attention her story had garnered. But she had come to realize that with visibility came opportunity, the chance to redirect attention toward the ongoing needs in their community and the organizations working to meet those needs. "Good evening," she began, her voice slightly trembling. "Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I want to start by saying that I'm still not entirely comfortable with all the attention I've received over the past few months. What I did that night wasn't extraordinary. It was simply what any decent human being should do when they see someone in need." She paused, gathering her thoughts as the audience listened intently. "When I stopped at that bus stop and gave a blanket to a stranger, I wasn't thinking about the consequences or how it might be perceived. I was just thinking about how cold it was going to get, and how I would want someone to help if I were in that situation." She looked out at the crowd, seeing nods of understanding and empathy. What happened next? The viral photo, the media attention, the outpouring of support? None of that was anything I could have predicted or intended. But as I've navigated these past few months, I've come to appreciate how one small act can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. She proceeded to talk not about herself, but about the broader issues of homelessness and poverty in their community. She shared statistics that painted a sobering picture of need, but also stories of hope and resilience that illustrated the difference that could be made when people work together. The blanket drive that was organized in response to that photo collected over 3,000 items, she continued. Those items have made a real difference in people's lives during these cold winter months. But the need extends far beyond what one drive can address. She spoke about the various organizations that had been doing this work long before her story brought attention to the issue. Shelters, food banks, community centers, and advocacy groups that operated year-round with limited resources and little recognition. "These are the organizations that truly deserve our support and recognition," she emphasized. "They're the ones doing the hard work day in and day out, with or without viral photos to draw attention to their efforts." As she spoke, she noticed a familiar face in the audience, the man from the bus stop, looking healthier and more confident than when she had first met him. He had found stable housing and was now working part-time at the shelter where he had first stayed, using his experience to help others navigating similar challenges. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod of encouragement. She smiled back, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I want to be clear about something, she continued, turning her attention back to the audience. I'm not a hero. I'm just a person who saw someone in need and did what I could to help. Each of you has that same capacity within you, to notice the needs around you and respond with compassion. She concluded her speech with a call to action, not just for donations, though those were certainly needed, but for greater awareness and engagement with the issues facing their community. The next time you see someone in need, I hope you'll remember that your small act of kindness could be the start of something much larger than you can imagine, not because it will go viral or bring you recognition, but because it might make a real difference in someone's life, and in doing so, it will make our community a little bit better for everyone. As she finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet, applauding enthusiastically. She felt a mix of emotions: relief that her speech was over, gratitude for the positive response, and continued discomfort with being the center of attention. After the event, as she was gathering her things to leave, several people approached her to share their own stories of helping others or being helped. Each story reinforced her belief that kindness was more common than the headlines might suggest. It just didn't usually get documented and shared in the same way that negative news did. The last person to approach her was a young woman who looked to be about the same age as her. "Daughter, I just wanted to thank you," the young woman said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "After reading your story, I started volunteering at the downtown shelter. It's changed my life in so many ways." She looked at the young woman, saw the genuine passion and commitment in her eyes, and felt that the discomfort of the past few months had been worth it, if it had inspired even one person to engage more deeply with their community. "That's wonderful," she replied sincerely. "Thank you for sharing that with me." As she drove home that night, she thought about how much her life had changed in just 6 months. The media attention had mostly subsided, though she still occasionally received messages from people who had been inspired by her story. The crowds outside her apartment building had long since dispersed, replaced by a more sustainable form of engagement, people supporting local organizations and initiatives, rather than seeking out the person who had inadvertently become a symbol of kindness. When she arrived home, her daughter was studying at the kitchen table, a textbook open in front of her and a highlighter in hand. "How did it go?" her daughter asked without looking up. "It went well, I think. People seemed to respond positively." "Good," her daughter replied, finally looking up with a smile. "You know, at first I was weird about all the attention, but I've realized something important." "What's that?" "You've shown me that one person really can make a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time." She felt a surge of emotion at her daughter's words. "That means a lot to hear you say that." "It's true," her daughter insisted. "And you've also shown me how to handle unexpected attention with grace and humility, even when it must have been really uncomfortable." "It was definitely uncomfortable at times," she admitted with a laugh. "But it's also been rewarding to see the positive impact it's had." Her youngest came into the kitchen, holding a piece of paper. "Mom, look what I made in art class today," he said, handing her a drawing. She looked at the picture, a simple but recognizable scene of a person handing a blanket to someone sitting on a bench. Above the drawing, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Kindness matters." "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." That night, as she lay in bed, she reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion on a cold winter night. The attention had been uncomfortable at times, even intrusive, but it had also created opportunities to make a real difference in her community. More importantly, it had taught her children valuable lessons about empathy, responsibility, and the impact that one person's actions could have. The following morning, she received a call from the community organization that had hosted the previous night's event. "I have some wonderful news," the director said excitedly. "Because of the inspiration from your speech last night, we've already received enough donations to expand our services for the upcoming year. We'll be able to help twice as many people as we did last year." She felt a surge of emotion at this news. "That's incredible. I'm so glad to hear that." "It's all because of you," the director insisted. "No," she replied gently. "It's because of everyone who chose to help." As she ended the call and prepared for her day, she thought about how far her simple act of kindness had reached. What had started as a spontaneous decision to help someone in need had, evolved into a community-wide movement that would continue to make a difference long after the media attention had faded. She knew that the problems of homelessness and poverty in their community hadn't been solved. There was still much work to be done, but she also knew that the connections forged through this experience, the increased awareness of needs, and the renewed commitment to helping others would create lasting change. 6 months ago, she had been a single mother struggling to make ends meet, trying to teach her children the value of compassion while navigating the challenges of everyday life. Today, she was still that same person, but she was also part of something larger, a community of people working together to make the world a little bit better, one small act of kindness at a time. As she looked out her window at the city below, she felt a sense of peace and purpose that hadn't been there before. The blanket she had given away on that cold winter night had been replaced many times over, not just in physical donations but in awareness, compassion, and a renewed sense of community responsibility. And that, she realized, was a legacy worth embracing.